We acknowledge that we record this on the land of the Paramount people and pay our respects to their elders past and present. G'day comrades, g'day Liz, how are we all?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Doing shows as health allows sure was a thing. Okay, so welcome back to our new papers in consciousness studies portion of the show. Today, Liz, I've chosen a paper by Barwich called Olfaction is a Spatial Sense, which was published this year in the Review of Philosophy and Psychology.
So my initial response was, of course.
Of course, yeah. Good. Hold on to that intuition. It's going to be important. So, Barwich is a name that might be familiar to listeners of Philosophy and Science podcast, as she's been interviewed by Sean Carroll on Mindscape and by Frankish and Goff on Mind Chat over the last few years. She's also someone that I follow on Blue Sky, so I'm a bit nervous about putting this out in case I get it completely wrong.
Meh.
just be wrong. It's fine.
Yeah. What's the problem?
Nothing's at stake in me being right, but, you know, I want to get other people's views correct.
Well, if you follow them on Blue Sky and you're wrong, you can find out.
I will find out, yes. Usually I don't find out that I'm wrong. So, Liz, I've chosen this paper not just because of its quality, but because, as we did with Corvid's last time out, it's a chance for us to learn something new. Unless you've been doing some secret work on Olfaction that I don't know about.
No.
No? Okay, cool.
Like I could not tell you about stuff I'm doing.
Indeed. You don't keep your thoughts private.
No.
Barwich starts by recounting some arguments that have been put forward in the past that aim to show that, in humans at least, smell is a non-spatial or minimally spatial sense. So, my note here says, I don't know about you, Liz, but actually I do know about you because you just told me 3 seconds ago. So
I'm like, who's ever found something by smelling?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm like, why would you think it was?
Yeah.
Like, that's going to take some pretty strong argument.
Yeah, so I was surprised, like you, that such arguments have been made. It seems wildly counterintuitive.
It's like saying that vision's not a spatial sense.
Yeah.
Prima facie it is, so you got some work to do.
Yeah, so it seems wildly counterintuitive to me to say that smell doesn't represent location or that we don't experience odours as coming from a particular thing. So, like when you smell salt and pepper eggplant being delivered to your table, it seems that you experience that thing as having the smell, right?
Sorry, when you try and work out where the dog did a shit in the house because it was locked inside. So, that was my experience this morning.
Yeah. My example is nicer.
Yeah. My example is more finding something based on space.
Just because something is counterintuitive doesn't mean it's wrong. Indeed. Necessarily. And these arguments exist in the literature, so Barwich is going to show us what's wrong with them. Barwich frames her discussion with two broad families of descriptions of smell that come from the analytic literature. The first of these families claims that smell has no representational content at all. Smells are purely sensations that can't represent space because they don't represent anything. The second family of claims that's going to frame Barwich's discussion here allows that smell does represent something, but the details of what determine whether or not space is represented, and that so sometimes smell is non-spatial. Both of these views, and Liz, we won't be surprised that they're coming from the analytic literature when Barwich contends that they are often based on little more than a particular philosopher reflecting on what their sense of smell seems like to them. So nothing really more than the examples that we opened with about the salt and pepper eggplant, and I'm going to stick with that one because it's much more pleasant than yours.
It's just a sorry, that bothers me because it's not a context where you're trying to find something.
Yeah, but it's tied to a particular spatially located object. But yeah, we'll see. There's sort of two arguments that are going to be relevant here from Barwich, which is tying smells to the representation of particularly spatial located objects, and the other is sort of spatial navigation stuff like what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so both are going to be relevant here. We're familiar with a variety of issues with this approach of just reflecting on your experience and seeing what it seems like, such as the theory dependence of such reflections, of course, being the major issue there. But just from the examples Barwich gives, we can see that such reflections do not produce any agreement. So she attributes to Chalmers the view that experience of smell float free of any object, but to Batty the view that smells seem to be sort of vaguely here. So there's no agreement produced by this method of just reflecting on what smell seems like to you. Thinking a bit about the theory dependence of these analyses, Barwich will challenge some of the assumptions that underlie the positions that she's criticising. Her first move is to question what she calls the deceptive immediacy of sensation. So she does this using the distinction between sensation and perception, similar to the form of the distinction that you get in an undergrad psychology textbook. Here, the issue is that if we take the approach of starting with our experiences and don't consider all the work our minds have to do unconsciously to construct those experiences, we end up oversimplifying them. Barwich is particularly concerned with the assumption that a smell or any sensation is something that is given at a single moment, rather than something which evolves over time. When we consider the experience of odours as temporally extended, we can more easily see all the inferential or computational work that goes into constructing the experience and its role in guiding action. In an example she attributes to arson, Barwich points out that the faintness of smell indicates the presence of something, say a gas leak, at a distance from oneself, and that this can be used to guide spatial behaviour, such as locating the leak. As she says, quote, "From a diachronic perspective, olfactory experience reveals spatial features like proximity, distance, and directionality," end quote. So from this sort of example, I think we begin to see some of the weird things that those who argue for the non-spatiality of smell need to be committed to. So, for example, Batty, who we introduced above, who said that the spatial content of smell is just a minimal here-ness, says, quote, "If we bracket the external source of the smell and waive our contingent knowledge of that source, smell has no directional or other spatial aspect," end quote. But what reason could we have for disregarding such knowledge? Couldn't it go into constructing the experience?
Yeah.
Because it feels weird, right?
Well, you can sort of abstract away and get the vibe of what they mean.
Yeah, but you could do this with anything, if we just bracket out the spatial content of any representation, then it's non-spatial.
Yeah.
So the question is whether that knowledge about source of the smell is, whether that goes into constructing the experience of smell, or whether that's something that's sort of separate and after.
Right.
Now, as I understand what Barwich argues next, she'll set out to show that that sort of knowledge about the source of the smell and so on goes into constructing the perception of smell. And this is sort of based on an analogy with vision. Barwich's first step is to show that the spatial content of visual experiences depends on unconscious inference in the same way as the purported spatial content of olfaction. So unconscious inference is a good candidate for one of those key concepts that we like to explain in the New Papers series list. So what do we mean by that?
It just means computation, that process that we're not aware of. I presume that a lot of you have seen ambiguous figures. So the duck rabbit or the old lady, young lady, where you can see it in two different ways. Now that's used to indicate that the stimuli can stay the same and our experience can vary because we are making various inferences, or I would say we're doing a computational process that can spit out different outputs on the same input.
Bistable images are really good because they have spatial content, sort of identifying particular objects and making a sort of figure ground separation, which is one of the ways that Barwich talks about this. Sounds don't usually come with this tag that tells you where they're coming from, but unless they're directly behind us or in front of us, we don't have any problem finding them. We unconsciously compute the location based on the timing differences between the sound wave hitting each ear. Similarly, for vision, light reaches our eyes and is focused onto a two-dimensional surface, yet we can unconsciously infer the presence of a three-dimensional object. One of the cues that is used to do this is the disparity of the image to each eye. So tricking this system is how random dot stereograms work.
Magic eye.
And magic eye. With random dot stereograms, you present slightly displaced images, one to each eye, and the subjects will put together that and experience a three-dimensional object, even though all that's being presented is these two images that look sort of like QR codes. If you've never had one of these experiences, you'll see things like a square floating above the sort of QR code image. Barwich gives some more examples here, highlighting the role of temporally extended objects and how we interact with them. So Liz, this will come back to the example that you came up with. So one of the places we see spatial content in vision is through figure ground separation. So Liz, could you remind us of what that is?
That's working out what's the object and what's the background. Mm-hmm. And so what happens with those ambiguous figures that I was talking about is what is the vases and the faces is the easiest one to see that. So when you're seeing the vase, you're seeing the middle bit as the object and the sides as the background. And when you see two faces, that middle bit that was the vase becomes the background, and you see that the surrounds of the vase as two faces.
I was going to use Wolverine Batman as an illusion.
I don't know that one.
You don't know that one? It's cool. We'll find a link to it.
I can figure it out.
Cool. So figure ground separation is something that we're quite good at. It's how we pick out a particular object presented to us and perceive it, as you say, Liz, as distinct from its background or its foreground. We're so good at this. It's one of those things Barwich was talking about earlier, where if we just reflect on our experiences and ignore all the unconscious work that goes into constructing them, we might ignore or skip over how complex this is. With those examples that we were talking about, like the faces vase illusion or the Wolverine Batman illusion, these sorts of bistable images, how we perceive them depends on exactly what Liz said before about what the visual system takes to be the figure and what the ground. Now, Barwich wants to emphasize that this is a spatial task, depending on the representation of things like edges and enclosed objects. The same sort of reasoning about figure ground separation would seem to apply to audition. So an example of figure ground separation in audition is the cocktail party effect. So Liz, what's that?
When you're at a cocktail party, you will suddenly hear when somebody says your name. So you can't hear the conversation, but suddenly you hear Liz and you turn around and look to see who's talking about you. And it's fascinating once you're aware of it to work out what you have the cocktail party effect for. So at various points in time, the word consciousness will pop out for me.
Yeah. Agency did for me for a while when I was writing about experience of agency, yeah.
So it doesn't have to be your name, but that's the classic example.
Yeah. So we suddenly have this perceptual figure, the name or whatever word it is, that seems to pop out against the background noise. So is this spatial in the same way as figure ground separation for vision?
I don't know how to answer that question.
Yeah. Well, if you hear your name or whatever you have the effect for, how do you respond to that?
You turn your head.
Turn your head, yeah. Right, okay. So that seems to be spatial as well, yeah. Is there something analogous for olfaction? Is there this sort of analogous spatial figure ground separation?
Well, that's why you chose the eggplant, because the smell of that pops out at you.
Yeah. Okay, so as a first step, like you say, Liz, we're able to pick out particular smells. In experiments, this involves giving subjects a target smell and then presenting them with it mixed into different concentrations or with different backgrounds, so other smelly things. People without perceptual differences can do these sorts of tasks fairly easily. That's not surprising in itself. What it amounts to, though, is that subjects pick out something as having a target odour in situations where quite different substances are activating their chemoreceptors. So this is analogous to how we can visually pick out the same object under different lighting conditions or hear the same word as spoken by different voices. So we're thinking here that what's actually getting onto your chemoreceptors is quite different if you have a banana smell mixed in with a pine smell than if you just had the banana mixed in water. But you're still able to pick out the target banana smell relatively straightforwardly. So we're happy to say that these are cases of perceptual constancy, where the same type of object, in this case the same kind of smelly thing, is identified in different instances against different backgrounds.
Right, yeah. You can pick out the salt and pepper eggplant in the Chinese restaurant or in the Japanese restaurant.
Yeah, regardless of, what else is being brought to the table.
Yeah.
That seems okay to me, but Barwich points out that there are many in the olfaction literature who don't think it follows from this that there are olfactory objects.
There aren't objects that smell.
Yeah. Well, that our smell sense doesn't represent a particular object as the smelly thing.
What?
Okay. Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
What?
Right. No, that seems full weird to me as well. But let's
Not half weird.
Yeah. No, full weird. let's have a look at what she says about this. So she attributes to Keller the view that these abilities can be explained by, that's the picking out a particular target odour, can be explained by the direction of attention and salience rather than
Sorry.
the representation of distinguishable objects as such.
But you can change whether you see the figure or the ground in vision by directing your attention. There's how you explain we do it, and then there's the content of the representation.
Yeah.
Like how is directing attention not just the unconscious inference?
Well, I had a very similar reaction.
Okay.
That the view that Barwich is attributing to Keller seems to be an influential position, but at least from Barwich's presentation of it, I'm not at all clear on why it's considered a viable alternative, which is a slower way of having the reaction that you just had.
Well, in a nicer way. That's the whole point of the podcast. You get to hear me go, boofed.
Yeah, and, just because we have big reactions to things doesn't mean that we think that the people who have put forward these positions are stupid or anything like that.
I just immediately thought of watching football.
Yeah.
I might yell at the ref, but that's because I'm
usually the ref
enjoying
is right.
the game,
Yeah.
not because I actually think the ref is cheating.
That's a really helpful analogy. I like it. So this is a quote from Barwich in describing Keller's position. And of course, we're considering Barwich's reading of Keller here. We haven't gone and chased up this paper ourselves. So let's come back to this quote. This is Barwich describing Keller's position. So, quote, Keller, 2017, argues that this inherent ambiguity in peripheral coding prevents olfaction from identifying stimuli as distinct objects of perception, end quote. But that would as well apply to any perceptual process, not just the chemosenses. Isn't the representation of perceptual objects how our sensory systems resolve the ambiguities? Like with the Necker cube, which is an inherently ambiguous stimulus, is resolved by representing one or other of the squares as the front face of the cube. I think Barwich is saying that Keller and others think that olfaction is different from vision in this way, but I couldn't at all get my head around exactly why they think it would be different, because all of this stuff about ambiguity of peripheral inputs and, bracketing knowledge about objects in the world and stuff just seems to apply to, like, vision. Yeah. So, I couldn't follow Barwich's reasoning completely here, which is 100% on me. But Barwich does characterise this as a debate which has reached an impasse. On one side, we have those that think figure ground separation of smell shows that there are spatially located objects represented by smell, and others who think that figure ground separation of smells can be explained without this. Maybe I missed something obvious in Barwich's write-up.
So the argument is figure ground proves that it's spatial.
That you're representing particular spatially defined objects.
And the response is...
attention is enough to explain figure ground separation.
How does figure ground mean it's spatial?
Because the objects that are being picked out are spatially defined.
Right. And so saying that attention changes which one is famous doesn't mean that the two representations, which are switching fame, aren't spatial. It seems beside the point. Or the argument...
if you put it like that, I think it does, because you'd then be saying, well, actually the objects picked out in olfaction aren't spatially defined, would be where you would end up. You'd have
it doesn't seem to attack the premise.
Yeah.
That you're switching between two representations that are about spatially located objects.
So there's got to be something here in this reasoning that I'm missing in my presentation of it. And maybe it's just because I didn't feel especially sympathetic towards the non-spatial
it really is that
side. So Barwich is going to suggest a reconceptualization of figure ground separation in smell that doesn't depend on the representation of distinct objects, but still involves the perception of space.
Why do they need to do that?
I think that this is an attempt to say that even if Keller is right that figure ground separation in olfaction doesn't involve the representation of distinct objects, it still involves the representation of space.
Cool. So it's give them enough right to as many of the premises as you can.
Yeah, so that's sort of how I'm reading it. It's like, this is where she said there was an impasse in the debate and that this would be one way to move on from it as well. All right, so how would this work? How would we get the representation of space without the representation of distinct objects? So she returns to this analogy to random dot stereograms in vision. From these, you can get the perception of depth by presenting slightly offset random dot images to each eye. In each image, there is no shape as such. The thing that looks like a QR code doesn't contain the square or whatever it is that seems to be floating above the background when you look at them through a stereoscope. Barwich emphasises here that the only cue in the images that the brain can use to construct the perception is the disparity of the images. From this, it separates the figure, the floating square, or whatever it is in the particular stimuli from background, the random dots. So spatiality, in this case, depth, she thinks then isn't intrinsic to vision either, but instead arises from whatever process computes the figure ground separation. That sounds like a really strong claim, but I think it's because it's couched in this language of the sensation-perception distinction, which Barwich is using.
Me again.
So like what you'd have in your first year psychology textbook that...
you have the experience of redness and then which is the sensation.
Yeah.
You have the experience of a round red object and then you have the experience of an apple.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah. And so...
And you can have the sensation without the perception.
Yeah. And I think, that spatiality isn't intrinsic to vision isn't intrinsic to visual sensation. And Barwich is using this language because there seem to be some who want to say that olfaction only produces sensations and never perceptions proper, so never this representation of objects.
I'm not sure I like that sensation-perception distinction. I think I'm going to keep jumping off the train because I want to reject that.
Yeah.
if that's the game we're playing, I can't get a mental model of what that distinction is.
Yeah, I really struggled with that as well.
That might go very deep into my beliefs about how colour vision actually works.
Yeah, that is constructive all the way up.
And that it's, which one is it? Lexical or, anyway, whatever I said in that paper, that 07 paper.
Yeah.
That it's like circles rather than a car. That it gets its meaning when you put it, well, you know, a circle can represent a circle, but also that more meaning comes when it's put in context.
Yeah, and so because, like, I'm like you, I don't like the sensation-perception distinction. My inclination is to sort of skip over some of this reasoning and then just end up here with this quote from Barwich, which I think we'd be more on board with, which is, quote, "Spatial content in vision arises only through the organisation of sensory input by unconscious processes, which are not unique to vision and cannot be confined strictly to visual processing," end quote. I think I'm okay with where she's ending up there. But the interesting then mechanistic question is, how does spatiality get into unconscious inferences? What Barwich talks about here, in particular, what she wants to emphasize is not just how we do that for a particular smell that we happen to be experiencing, but how we get better at this through, like, our kinesthetic development. So as we get better in learning to move about the world. So figure ground separation in olfaction, and indeed she wants to say this is the same type of process for all the senses, I think, is dependent on the kind of unconscious inferences we mentioned earlier. These inferences are based on learning. Now, there's a bit here where she deals with a potential objection from modularity, which I suspect was put in just to deal with a particular reviewer's objections.
You've got to love those.
Because nothing she's said so far really invites an objection from modularity. So, I mean, I think we can skip over some of that and just get to the interesting part about how representation of space gets into our senses, on her view.
Okay.
So, in very general terms, she thinks that the source of spatiality is learning to move. So now it's time to try and get a bit more specific. So we're talking here about embodiment, at least in the minimal sense that the function of the mind is to move us about the world. She does step it up a bit, though, saying, this is a quote, "Basic motor skills and nuanced internal activity as motion provide the intentional, experiential foundation of human cognitive development and its structure, exceeding more moderate views of embodiment that treat such activities as merely enabling mental states." End quote. So I think to understand this, it's sort of helpful to think of this as sort of falling in a family of views with like Damasio's modern version of the James Lang take on the feeling of emotions. So feelings for Damasio are body states or as if body states, that is representations of body states. And so he's saying that the mature feelings of emotions that we get come from learning to represent these as if body states. Barwich's view, I think, is like that, but because her focus is on spatiality, she's sort of more interested in the representation of agentive movements. In the case of olfaction, the most immediately obvious relevant motions are sniffing patterns, so changing the orientation of your head, moving toward or away from smells that's important. For instance, this is a quote, for instance, the sense of where an odor originates or the spatial relationships between odor sources are not pre-configured but emerge through repeated encounters with varying environmental and bodily conditions, end quote. So this is just a way of saying that you learn the difference between someone else standing in dog shit and you standing in it by not watching where you put your feet. What's the evidence for this? Given this argument about the source of the representation of space, I expected Barwich to discuss developmental studies more. What we're thinking about here in terms of the representation of space is how do I get to it? How do I get away from it? So she's going to...
I thought it was where is it?
Yeah, but that's...
Piggybacks on...
Yeah, that's what she's saying is that where is it comes from? How do I get to it? How do I get away from it?
What does comes from mean? My representation that it's there comes from a process that computes how do I get near it? How do I get away from it? Is that what she means?
Yeah.
The process that produces it's there computes how do I get to it? How do I get away from it?
So this is done in terms of what movements can I make?
Yep, well that makes sense.
I thought there might have been some discussion of developmental studies. There's some mention of that with regards to vision. But with olfaction, the studies she focuses on were done with adults. As I understand the argument here, she thinks that what she's said so far is enough to do away with those weird positions we learned about earlier that say there's no spatiality in olfaction. And now she's going to use these experiments to show the details of what spatiality there is. Mm-hmm. So this comes in two parts. The first is about, quote, mapping odours within a virtual space or cognitive map, end quote. The second, quote, is about the co-representation and integration of olfactory and spatial information, end quote. Now, the second thing here, where she says co-representation, I think she's using this in a way that neuroscientists might use the term. That it's more about shared neural resources rather than representation proper. To this first point about mapping odours within a virtual space or a cognitive map, Barwich talks about some studies which show that people can and do use smell to navigate a two-dimensional space. In these studies, subjects are given a grid with a priming smell, say 10% banana and 10% pine, the rest water, and they're then asked to predict on the grid where a target mixture, say 40% pine and 30% banana, will be. People can do that. As Barwich says, this is enough to challenge the idea that smell is inherently non-spatial. But in addition to this, some of the neural resources that become more active in this task are the same that are thought to be important for other spatial navigation tasks.
Using different sensors.
Yeah. You know, Liz, that on its own we don't often consider imaging data to be great evidence, but in this context we can consider this to be consistent with Barwich's point about shared kinds of unconscious inferences, generating perceptions in different senses. Yeah,
imaging is useful for triangulation. I like using it here because if you think that the changes in activity when we're using a sense we're happy to grant is spatial, is evidence that that's where the spatial computation is happening, then if you see similar changes in activity in a different task that on the surface also seems spatial, then that's a reason to think that the second task. So if you see, so I quite like its use here.
Yeah. And so at least the non-spatial people would have to come up with a story about
why the bit that they think is spatial when we're using vision isn't spatial when we're using...
Yeah, what's it doing in this task that isn't computing space?
If there's good reasons to think it is.
Yeah. Barwich does consider a complication here. Again, this comes from the analogy she's been drawing with vision. In vision, there can be a dissociation with motor actions guided by vision and how things seem to be visually. A classic example of this would be the Ebbinghaus circles illusion, where two identical circles look to be different sizes depending on the size of other circles you put around them. So you put big ones around one copy of it and smaller ones around the other, and the one with the smaller ones around it looks bigger. But the motor system doesn't seem to be tricked by this because subjects make indistinguishable movements if they're asked to grasp the circles. They move the same way.
And that's not to do with the grain of the motor system. If the circles were in fact as different in size as they are reported to be, we would be able to measure differences in the gestures.
The potential objection here is subtle. There seems to be an object of perception, the circles that are experienced as different, that is dissociable from the kinesthetics. Can kinesthetics be the basis of how such perceptions are constructed? This is one place where Barwich emphasises the task dependence of different representations and the importance of learning. It's kinesthetic learning that she thinks is important for creating the unconscious inferences that lead to spatial representations that we're aware of. She's not saying that the kinesthetics in the mature system must exactly match how they perceptually seem, just that they come from that in development. Could this invite another objection, though? So apparently some people have claimed that we have an innate hardwired framework for navigation that maps which are independent of learning. Look,
what?
I don't want to spend a lot of time on that.
The newborn brain?
Yeah. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that because it's not an interesting proposal. If you are interested in that, you can look at what Barwich has to say about how bits of brain tissue, which are supposed to be the basis of such a framework, change their reactivity over development in rats. So even if there is spatially sensitive network to start with, it's still modified by learning, at least. If you like, you can also read about how and when rats are trained to find particular smells at particular locations. There are brain cells whose firing rate is responsive to just odour, and others that are responsive to the odour and the location. And look, that sounds cool, but I couldn't tell from the write-up here if that meant that only the odour in the location changed the firing rate of those neurons, or if the odour exclusive or the location changed the firing rate. And I didn't particularly want to go and pick up a rat neuroscience paper. Anyway, I think we know that trying to go from what individual cells change their firing rate to what is being computed or represented in that network is not a straightforward inference. So I didn't find the single cell recording stuff there as compelling as the simple fact that rats can learn to associate smells with a particular location. At any rate, there is some evidence there that there are neural circuits which are responsive to both spatial cues and odour. With that, we'll call it a day. Next time out, we'll do a 101 episode, and I want to introduce the phenomenology versus access consciousness distinction.